I always thought I'd know when someone was lying to me, especially my own son. But that night, with the rain tapping the kitchen window and my hands trembling around a lukewarm cup of tea, I couldn't see the truth staring right at me. Maybe I didn't want to. Griffin called me around 11:32 p.m. I remember the time because I'd been debating whether to take my sleeping pill early or not. I wish I had. I wish I'd slept through that call. "Mom, I need your help." His voice cracked like static, low and fast like he was whispering through a storm. "It's bad. I don't know who else to call." My son. My beautiful, brilliant, broken boy. What happened? I stood in the doorway of the kitchen, the floor tiles cold beneath my bare feet. The house was dark, save for the soft yellow undercabinet lighting I never turned off. It was the kind of light that made everything feel more intimate, more honest. It betrayed me that night. "There's someone," he hesitated. "I messed up, okay? I'm being blackmailed." Blackmailed. My heart twisted. By who? He didn't say. Instead, he rushed into excuses, veiled threats, pleading. "I'll lose everything. My job's already on the line, and this'll ruin me. Please, I need $25,000 by tomorrow." The word stuck in my throat like gravel. 25. Griffin, what are you talking about? "Mom, please. This isn't just about me. It's about survival." I should have asked more questions. I should have demanded names, proof. But instead, I walked to my desk, opened my checkbook, and transferred the funds. The weight in my chest told me I was being manipulated, but the ache in my gut whispered that if I didn't help him, I'd never forgive myself. That's how it always was with Griffin. Even when he was a child, he had this charm, this ability to spin his pain into poetry. When he was 7 and got caught stealing a pocket knife from the hardware store, he cried so hard I ended up buying it for him. He said he wanted to feel strong. I didn't question it. Now, at 34, he still had that same sad charm, though dulled by life and poor choices. After I sent the money, I sat in the dark and let the silence settle over me. The house felt hollow, like a set I was acting in. I remembered a night 5 years earlier when his ex-wife, Sadie, stood on my front porch, soaked in rain, tears streaming down her face. She'd come to tell me the truth, but I never opened the door. Griffin had already painted her as unhinged. "She's trying to turn you against me," he'd said, a flicker of desperation in his eyes. "She wants to take everything." I believed him. Or maybe I just didn't want to deal with the shame of having gotten it all so wrong. Sadie had been a force of quiet strength when I first met her. Auburn hair, a voice like wind through trees. She wasn't flashy, wasn't particularly outgoing, but she had this grounded grace that drew people in. Griffin fell fast and hard, and I thought, maybe he'd finally found someone who could keep him tethered. But less than 2 years in, everything changed. He'd come home red-eyed, silent. She'd shrink in his presence. At first, I chalked it up to stress, young marriage, work. But then he started telling stories. She screamed at me for being 10 minutes late. She threw a glass at the wall. She says I make her feel invisible. "She's gaslighting me, Mom." And I listened. I nodded. I held him. I didn't call her, didn't ask her side. That was my sin. Not the lie itself, but the ease with which I accepted it. In my kitchen that night, I poured myself a scotch, something I rarely did anymore. I hadn't even changed out of my robe. My reflection in the glass door looked foreign, tired, soft around the edges. I'd spent a lifetime being strong, being the fixer. For Griffin, for my late husband, for everyone but myself. I could still hear Griffin's voice in my head. "I'll pay you back, I promise. Just don't tell anyone, okay?" Of course not. Loyalty is a strange thing. It feels noble even when it's rooted in fear. I spent the next morning scouring my memories, trying to find the moment things had shifted. Was it when Griffin dropped out of his master's program without telling anyone? Or when he stopped inviting me over, saying Sadie didn't feel comfortable around me? She used to bring me homemade granola, told me stories about growing up with a mother who called her too much for crying. I remember her once saying, "Griffin's the first man who didn't ask me to be smaller." Looking back, I should have heard the desperation in that. After they split, Griffin moved in with me for 6 months. Said he needed time to get his bearings. I never asked why Sadie left. I just assumed she couldn't handle his moods, his volatility. I made excuses the same way I always had. He had a hard childhood. He missed his father. He was sensitive. Now, 5 years later, I was wired $25,000 lighter and beginning to unravel. I walked into Griffin's old bedroom, which I'd left mostly untouched. The shelves still held his books: Kerouac, Vonnegut, Bukowski, the holy trinity of angry, misunderstood men. His journals were still locked in the drawer he thought I didn't know about. I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching my phone. I could call him, ask more, demand transparency. But I didn't. Something about the desperation in his voice the night before. It didn't feel real. It felt rehearsed. The doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, there was no one there, just an envelope on the mat, no stamp, hand-delivered. Inside was a card, cream-colored, plain, one sentence written in pen. Ask him why he really needs the money. No name, no return address, just that single sentence, like a ghost from my past tapping me on the shoulder. My heart pounded as I stepped outside, scanning the street. A car idled at the corner, but it pulled away before I could make out the driver. I clutched the card against my chest. Somewhere, beneath years of enabling and excuses, I felt the stirrings of an old instinct I hadn't used in a long time. Doubt. Real, sharp-edged, painful doubt. And for the first time since I picked up that phone, I wondered if Griffin had ever been in danger at all. Griffin and Sadie's wedding was the kind of small, late autumn affair that leaves you feeling both warm and unfinished. I remember the way the golden leaves scattered across the lawn like blessings, and the way Sadie's fingers shook when she slipped the ring on his hand. I told myself it was nerves. I told myself a lot of things back then. In the photos, Griffin's smile is wide, too wide, and Sadie, her eyes don't quite match her mouth. She looks like someone mid-thought, mid-decision. Still, they danced under string lights, drank champagne from mismatched flutes, and kissed like they believed in the myth they were building. I used to flip through those wedding photos when I missed him. Not Griffin the man he became, but the boy I used to know. The one who wrote poetry on napkins and played Miles Davis while he did his homework. But as I turned the pages now, 5 years later, the moments didn't shine. They stung. A different kind of ache had set in. I saw it, finally. The way Sadie's hand rested lightly on his back, never gripping, never owning, and how, in every shot, Griffin seemed to lean slightly away. I ignored the signs, I whispered aloud, voice catching in the hush of my living room. I told myself every couple fights. But their fights were different. They didn't burn hot and flare out. They were quiet, suffocating. Griffin would leave for days. Sadie would sleep on the couch, and I, like a fool, called it growing pains. I closed the album and set it beside the others. They were all lined up on the bookshelf, cataloging birthdays and anniversaries and vacations that looked idyllic, but were layered in denial. I reached for the envelope at the back of the shelf. It had been there for years. I'd never opened it. It was from Sadie. I recognized her tight, slanted handwriting. She'd mailed it the week she moved out. I remember the day it arrived. I'd just gotten back from my bridge group, and Griffin was pacing the kitchen, face tight, fists clenched. "She's trying to poison you against me," he said when he saw it in my hand. "She'll twist everything. Please don't read it, Mom. Don't let her in your head." So I didn't. I tucked it away. Loyalty, even when it's misplaced, can look a lot like love. Now, my fingers trembled as I slid my thumb under the seal. The paper was brittle with time. Her words were soft but unflinching. I loved him, I did. But he made me small. He lied when it was easy and yelled when it wasn't. I tried to reach you, I tried to show you. But you loved him more than the truth, and I couldn't survive both of you. I'm not writing this to punish. I'm writing this so maybe, someday, you'll see me as more than the woman who left your son. I sat for a long time after that. The silence was so thick, I could feel it press against my skin. I thought of Derek, my late husband, Griffin's father, a man who had a way of looking at you like he was measuring how much trouble you were worth. I'd fallen for him at 19 because he was the first person who made me feel chosen. And I stayed, even when he stopped choosing me. He was emotionally remote, quick to anger, and impossible to please. When Griffin was a boy, he used to wait at the top of the stairs to hear Derek's mood before coming down for dinner. I told myself it built character. What it built was fear. I never left. I told myself that was strength, that loyalty was noble. But the truth? I was just afraid of being alone with who I might be without him. I see it now, how I taught Griffin to chase approval and use affection like currency. How I taught him, by example, that women stay and smile, even when they're crumbling. And when Sadie entered the picture, with her gentle voice and fierce convictions, she threatened that narrative. She didn't crumble. She confronted. I hated it, though I didn't know why at the time. Maybe because she reminded me of who I could have been if I'd ever dared. I opened another drawer, one I hadn't touched since Griffin moved out. Inside were old notes from him, receipts, scraps of a life lived mostly on my dime and my guilt. And then, beneath it all, a voicemail cassette, something he gave me when he was working on a podcast idea years ago. I set it in the old player I still kept around, pressed play, expecting to hear a script or interview. Instead, I heard his voice. "Yeah, she bought it," he laughed, a low, mocking chuckle. "Told her it was blackmail, hook, line, and sinker. Gonna flip the cash into something real this time. At least I'll get a stake in the app." There was a pause. The sound of a can popping. Another voice, unfamiliar, male. "Thought you said the app folded." Griffin again, this time more cynical. "Yeah, but she doesn't know that." My knees buckled. I sat down, hard, against the coffee table. The tape kept playing, but I'd heard enough. The truth in his voice was heavier than any lie he'd ever told. He was never in danger. There was no blackmailer, no threat. Just another venture, another failed gamble. And I was the safety net he knew would catch him, even when he'd lit the fire himself. I should have cried. I should have screamed. But what I felt was colder than rage. It was clarity. In that moment, the image of Griffin I had clung to, my boy, my broken artist, my misunderstood son, it cracked. And through the fracture, I saw Sadie, standing alone, soaked and trembling, knocking on my door, begging to be heard. And me, on the other side, pretending not to listen. The house had always been too big for one person, but it felt cavernous now. I moved through it slowly, as if the walls were listening. Maybe they were. Maybe they always had been. I started with the boxes. I didn't even know what I was looking for. Answers, maybe. Forgiveness, if I was lucky. The attic was stifling, dust hanging in the air like regret. I pulled down the ladder and climbed, the wood groaning beneath me like an old secret. The first box was labeled Griffin and Sadie. I'd forgotten I kept it. Inside were cards, mementos, saved invitations, crumpled programs from gallery exhibits where Sadie had her early showings. I unfolded a piece of stationery. Her handwriting, elegant but purposeful, filled the page. A letter, addressed to me. "I wanted to thank you for the lemon bars you made last Sunday. I didn't say it then, but they reminded me of my grandmother. It was the first time I felt like maybe I belonged. I know Griffin is complicated, but I love him. I just hope one day you'll see I love him enough to stay honest, even when it's hard." It was dated 2 months before the divorce. I found more letters, dozens, some never sent, others tucked inside books I'd stored away without reading. I spent hours opening them, watching the story of their unraveling play out in Sadie's words. She wrote about Griffin's temper, how he'd disappear for days and return smelling like bourbon and indifference. She described gaslighting, how he'd rewrite entire conversations, deny things he'd said, then accuse her of being too sensitive when she tried to explain. "He tells me I make him anxious, that my silence is manipulative," one note read. "But when I speak, he says I'm hysterical. I'm not sure who I am anymore, but I know I'm disappearing." I closed the letter and stared at the exposed beams above me. I had heard those words before, through tears, in whispers, but never from her. I'd told myself she was dramatic. I'd told myself Griffin was stressed. I'd told myself anything but the truth. That Thanksgiving came back in sharp, uncomfortable detail. We'd all been sitting at the table. Griffin had been restless, picking at his food. Sadie passed him the mashed potatoes and he muttered something about carbs and control. She smiled, but I remember now, the kind of smile that stretches skin, but not muscle. He made a joke about her interrogation voice, and she laughed a second too late. Then he knocked over his wine glass and said, "God, Sadie, could you be more uptight?" Back then, I scolded her for snapping. I told her she needed to choose her battles. But now, I hear the exhaustion in her voice when she finally said, "I'm tired of walking on eggshells." She wasn't starting a fight. She was calling for help. And I'd passed her the salt. That night, after hours in the attic, I came down with one of the boxes. I sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by the pieces of a life I had refused to see. The doorbell rang just as I was rereading Sadie's final letter. I nearly ignored it, but something in me stirred. It was Lena. We hadn't spoken in 3 years, not since our last fight at Mom's funeral, when she accused me of raising Griffin without boundaries. "You always believed men first," she'd said, voice shaking. Now she stood on my doorstep in a windbreaker, holding a bag of groceries. I blinked at her like she was an echo. "You going to let me in, or are we reenacting a soap opera?" Inside, we made tea. The silence between us had texture. Rough, familiar. She glanced at the papers spread across the table. "So you finally opened them?" I nodded. She took a long sip. "You remember when Griffin was 15 and he pushed that neighbor kid off his bike? Lena, you told him he was just defending himself. Said the other boy probably started it. Do you remember what you told me when I said he needed consequences?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. "You said boys will be boys," she said quietly. I remember thinking, how many people is he going to hurt before you stop making excuses? I thought I was protecting him. You were protecting yourself from admitting you failed. It hit like a slap because it was true. I'd wrapped my motherhood around my mistakes, called it devotion. I thought love meant shielding, not shaping. I thought it was enough to be there, even when there meant silent. Lena softened, reaching for one of the letters. "She wrote me too," she said. "Right before she left. Said she wished I'd been her mother-in-law instead." I bit my lip to keep from crying. "I didn't reply," she added. "I was afraid of making things worse between you and me." We sat with that, shared guilt, the shape of silence. Later, I returned to the attic. There was one more box marked Sadie Misk. I hadn't touched it since she moved out. Inside was a small, carefully wrapped parcel with a ribbon still intact. A note attached. "Thought you'd like this for your garden. A-room. Thank you for always asking about my art." I unwrapped it slowly. A framed watercolor, delicate violets blooming from a cracked teacup. I turned it over. The title was written on the back, Resilient. I'd never opened it. I never even thanked her. The next morning, I called Griffin. I didn't plan what to say. I just let the phone ring until he picked up. "Hey, Mom," he said, voice casual, too casual. "You good?" "I listened to the tape," I said quietly. "The one you left in your old drawer." There was a beat of silence. "You lied to me, Griffin." A scoff. "It's not like that. I also read Sadie's letters, all of them. You weren't protecting yourself. You were abusing her." His silence then wasn't guilt. It was calculation. "She manipulated you." "She still is," he said, tone sharp. "You're letting her twist everything." "No," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "You did that, and I let you." He hung up. I sat in that stillness again, this time not as a prisoner, but as a witness. The past had a voice, and I was finally listening. I used to pride myself on not being one of those women, the ones who needed validation, who chased closure, who raised their voices when they should have lowered their expectations. I told myself I was different, reasonable, calm, strong. I wore silence like a badge of honor. But now I understand it wasn't strength. It was shame, packaged and passed down. After reading Sadie's letters, I couldn't sleep. I walked the house barefoot, each floorboard creaking like an accusation. The kitchen window reflected a woman I didn't recognize, one who had let herself be complicit. A woman who raised a son without ever teaching him to see women as people instead of props. Why did I teach my son that women were disposable? I asked the dark. My voice broke as soon as I said it, because I had been disposable once. To my father, to Derek, to every man who patted my head for being sensible while they shattered something soft in me. And I had smiled through it, because that's what good women do. I had judged women like Sadie, women who asked for more, who named their pain, who refused to shrink. I told myself they were dramatic, unstable, needy. I told myself that because it was easier than admitting I was jealous. that I had never been brave enough to want more, and she had. I sat at the dining table with a legal pad and pen, trying to write a letter of apology to Sadie. The words felt stale, inadequate. I couldn't go back, and I didn't know how to move forward, so I reached out to the only person I thought might listen, Tasha. I remembered her vividly. Sharp-witted, sharp-tongued, the kind of woman who spoke with her entire body. She was Sadie's best friend, and I never liked her. Not because of anything she did, but because she saw through me. Saw how I clung to the role of peacekeeper. How I wore my motherhood like armor. She never let me hide. It took 2 voicemails and a text before she responded. The message was curt. 1 hour, Fletcher's Cafe, no games. I got there early. Ordered coffee I didn't want. My hands trembled as I stirred in cream. She arrived 5 minutes late, dressed in black, sunglasses still on despite the overcast sky. She sat without a word, took out a manila folder, and placed it beside her. "I don't know why I came," she said, "but here I am." "I'm not here to defend him," I said quickly, "or myself." She raised an eyebrow but didn't speak. I swallowed. I need to know who she was when I wasn't looking. Tasha finally removed her sunglasses. Her eyes were fierce, rimmed with a quiet hurt. "She was everything you refused to see," she said. "Smart, talented, scared out of her goddamn mind. You always acted like she was a ticking bomb, but Griffin was the one lighting fuses." The waitress came. We waved her off. "She didn't leave because she wanted to," Tasha continued. "She left because she was going to lose herself if she didn't." I lowered my gaze. "He told me she manipulated him, that she was cold, controlling." Tasha laughed bitterly. "Of course he did. Abusers don't wear signs, they tell stories." She opened the manila folder and slid a single page across the table. It was a restraining order, issued 3 weeks before their divorce. Griffin had threatened to destroy her business, said he'd ruin her reputation if she went public with anything. "He came to her gallery opening drunk," Tasha said. "Screamed at her in front of clients. Said she owed him everything, that he made her." I touched the edge of the document, fingers numb. "She filed it the next morning. Didn't even tell me until it was done. Said she was ashamed. Said she thought you might finally believe her if she disappeared quietly." I looked up. "Why didn't you come to me? Would you have listened?" Tasha's voice was low, not unkind. "You helped him break her, and you never even asked her why she left." That line stayed with me, even as we parted without hugging, without closure. I walked home under a sky that threatened rain and thought about how many women I'd betrayed. Not just Sadie, but myself, my mother, Lena. That night, I opened my laptop. A desperate instinct compelled me to search something I hadn't dared to before. Sadie's old business. She had started a line of eco-friendly textiles. Threaded Roots. I remembered the name from a discarded flyer Griffin once tossed in the trash. He'd mocked it, said it sounded like a Pinterest board. I typed in the name, and the page redirected to a new company. Same designs, same copy, but a different logo. And a different registered owner, Griffin. I stared at the screen, heart pounding. He'd stolen it. Not just her trust or her peace, but her vision. The idea he'd pitched to me 3 months ago. Sustainable fabrics, minimalist design, ethically sourced production, it wasn't his. It was hers. I scoured old emails, dated proposals, everything matched. He hadn't even changed the mission statement. I felt sick. The pieces rearranged themselves. The money, the timing, the lie. The startup he'd claimed he was trying to build wasn't some noble attempt at reinvention. It was theft. A rebranding of something he never created, only destroyed. The worst part? I funded it. I sent the final transfer 2 days before the company relaunch went live. I closed the laptop and stared at my reflection in the black screen. For the first time in decades, I felt the full weight of what it meant to be a mother. Not the nurturer, the savior, the martyr, but the mirror, the one who reflects back what she teaches. And I had taught him, in 100 subtle ways, that women's ideas were his to borrow, their patience, his to test, their stories, his to rewrite. I stood up, walked to the garden room, and pulled Sadie's painting from the attic shelf. The violets in the cracked teacup looked different now, not delicate, defiant. I hung it above the fireplace and sat in its quiet defiance. Griffin hadn't just lied. He had erased, and I had let him. But I wasn't going to let it happen again. Sadie opened the door without saying anything. She didn't look surprised to see me. Maybe Tasha had warned her, or maybe she'd expected it all along. This awkward, overdue reckoning between the two of us. Either way, she stepped aside, motioning me in with the kind of quiet that doesn't need words to assert boundaries. Her home smelled of lavender and sawdust, soft and grounding. The walls were painted in warm earth tones, not quite coordinated, but full of life. The floors creaked in places, the rugs were mismatched, and art, her art, covered every available surface. It wasn't a gallery, it was a resurrection. The studio was nestled in the back of the house. Light spilled through oversized windows, pooling onto wide tables covered with brushes, fabric samples, and half-finished canvases. A linen dress hung from a dress form in the corner. On a shelf above the workbench sat the watercolor she'd gifted me years ago, the violets blooming from a cracked teacup. "You hung it," I said, unsure why that surprised me. "I had to," she replied. "It reminded me what I survived." She didn't ask me to sit, but I did anyway, folding my hands in my lap like a schoolgirl waiting to be graded. Sadie remained standing, one hip against the counter, arms crossed. Her posture was guarded, but there was no trace of bitterness, just distance. "I've read the letters," I started, "and the restraining order, and I know what Griffin did with your business idea." Her jaw tightened slightly, but she said nothing. "I funded it," I admitted. "Without knowing. I didn't—" "You didn't want to know," she interrupted, her tone sharp but calm. "That's always been the issue, hasn't it?" I believed him. "I know." I searched her face for a flicker of resentment, but found only fatigue. Not the kind that comes from sleepless nights, but the kind that comes from carrying yourself through fire and still being expected to smile on the other side. "I came here to apologize." Sadie shook her head, almost a laugh. "Apologies are currency for the guilty. They're rarely useful to the people who endured the damage." I swallowed. "Then what do you want?" She took her time answering. Walked to the window, looked out. The backyard was modest, untamed, full of herbs and wildflowers. "I want the truth to stop being optional," she said. There was a long pause before I could speak again. "Why didn't you fight for him harder?" The words left my mouth before I could weigh them. They hung there, heavy and selfish and stupid. Sadie turned to face me, her eyes sharp. "Because I was too busy surviving you both." It landed like a slap, but I didn't flinch. She took a deep breath and sat across from me, finally, folding one leg under the other. "You think I left because I stopped loving him. I didn't. I left because I was drowning and you kept handing me stones. I didn't know. You didn't ask." The silence stretched. Outside, a wind chime clinked lazily. Inside, the weight of our history settled between us like dust on old furniture. "I thought I was protecting him," I said, quieter now. "You were protecting your image of him, the boy you raised, the story you told yourself about being a good mother. Maybe I wasn't." Sadie didn't reply. She didn't have to. I looked around the studio again. Her work was everywhere. Bold strokes, vulnerable lines, colors that clashed just enough to feel human. It was more than art. It was her history, her healing. "I remember the day I moved out," she said after a moment. "Griffin had disappeared again. 2 days, no word. When he came back, he called me paranoid. Said I was trying to control him. I packed a single suitcase and left. Do you know what he told me as I walked out?" I shook my head. That I'd come crawling back. That no one else would have me. My stomach twisted. "And you," she added, "told me to be patient. That he just needed space." I believed he was struggling. He was. But struggling doesn't excuse cruelty. And you treated my boundaries like they were betrayals. I nodded slowly, the shame sitting heavy on my chest. "There were nights," she continued, "when I'd stare at the ceiling and think, if I vanish, will anyone notice? If I say something, will anyone believe me?" She wiped a tear away quickly, like she resented its presence. "I wanted to believe you'd at least listen, but you didn't. So I stopped talking." I leaned forward, unable to stay in my own skin. "What can I do now?" "You can start by not trying to fix this." "Then what?" "Make it matter," her words echoed. "Do something with what you know, not just for me, but for the next Sadie." The next woman who gets called unstable when she's just trying to breathe. I felt like I was exhaling for the first time in years. I don't expect forgiveness, I said. I'm not offering it, she replied without malice. Not yet, maybe not ever. We sat in silence again, this time less out of discomfort and more because neither of us knew how to end this chapter. After a while, she stood and walked over to the counter, pouring us both a fresh cup of coffee. She slid one toward me. No sugar, just cream, exactly how I used to drink it. I hated how much I wanted your approval, she said softly. It made me furious. I nodded. I hated how much I feared your truth. We sipped in tandem. I'm trying, I added, almost to myself. Sadie gave a small nod. So try, but not just with words. I left without promises. She didn't ask me to call again. She didn't hug me. But she didn't close the door behind me either. On my way out, I looked back through the window of her studio. She was already painting again, brush in hand, light on her face, not waiting for anyone, not begging to be believed, just creating, just surviving. And for the first time, I saw her clearly. Not as the woman who left my son, but as the woman who saved herself from him. The sky was churning, heavy clouds rolling in, the kind that made you feel small and watched. I stood at the kitchen sink, the folder of evidence against my son still on the counter behind me. Emails, business filings, timelines, receipts of betrayal, neatly printed and paper-clipped. I'd asked Griffin to meet me in the backyard at 5. He didn't respond, but I knew he'd come. He always did when he thought there was something left to take. When he appeared, it was with his usual swagger, the confident stride, the curated concern behind his eyes. He wore a button-down, sleeves rolled up like someone who wanted to look casual but in control, like someone rehearsing sincerity. You said it was important? He asked. I didn't reply right away. I motioned for him to follow me outside. The air had gone thick with the promise of rain. Our backyard, the same one he used to play in barefoot and wild, now felt like a courtroom. I laid the folder on the patio table, opened it, and slid it toward him. He barely glanced at it. You know what this is? Griffin shrugged. Looks like Sadie's little smear campaign. It's proof, I said, that you lied, that the business you told me was yours, the one I funded was hers. You rebranded her designs, her mission, and claimed it as your own. His expression didn't falter. She gave up on it. She didn't have the drive. I took something with potential and gave it a future. You took what wasn't yours and sold it like you were doing her a favor. Why are we doing this? His tone was changing now, sharp, defensive. You always told me to go after what I wanted. Not like this, he scoffed, stepped back. You're really going to take her side? I'm not taking sides. I'm facing the truth. You don't know the truth. You never have. I know you weren't being blackmailed. I know you used me. I know you were never in danger. You just knew I'd write the check. Lightning flashed in the distance. The wind pushed through the trees, rustling years of denial. He stepped forward, voice louder. I was desperate. Do you even understand what it's like to have nothing to show for your life at my age? I was drowning. No, I said. You weren't drowning. You were dragging people under with you. You were supposed to protect me. I met his eyes, unwavering. No, I was supposed to raise you better. There it was, spoken and sharp, his face twisted like I'd struck him. You always chose everyone else over me, he snapped. Dad, Lena, now Sadie. You act like you're some martyr, but you abandoned me the second I stopped being your golden boy. I didn't abandon you, I said. I enabled you. That ends today. Griffin's face contorted with rage. Fine, keep your money. I don't need it. You never did, I said. You just needed someone to blame. I turned away and walked back into the house, letting the screen door slam behind me. The storm broke 20 minutes later. Thunder cracked so close it made the windows tremble. I stood in the hallway staring at the folder still on the table. The evidence wasn't just about Griffin's lies. It was a record of how far I'd gone to protect an illusion. That night, around midnight, the doorbell rang. At first I thought it might be Griffin again, ready for round 2, maybe, or worse. But when I opened the door, it wasn't him. It was Monroe. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her hoodie was soaked through. Her hands clutching the straps of her backpack were shaking. I recognized the look in her eyes. I'd seen it before. on Sadie's face the night she stood in that same spot and I didn't open the door. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I stepped aside. She sat on the edge of the couch like she didn't know how to occupy space anymore. Her hair was pulled back, face pale and stripped of the youthful glow I'd seen in photos Griffin posted. "I didn't know who else to call," she said. "I'm glad you called me." She nodded, eyes darting around the room like she was waiting for someone to appear and tell her she wasn't allowed to be here. "I found the business plan," she said. "The original one. It had Sadie's name all over it. He told me she stole it from him. But that's not true, is it?" "No," I said gently. "It's not." Her hands tightened on her knees. "I'm pregnant," she whispered. The room didn't move. I did. I sat beside her, not touching, just close enough. "Have you told him?" She nodded. "He said we'd figure it out, that he'd take care of me. But then he disappeared for 3 days. When he came back, he said I was suffocating him, that I was using the baby to trap him." I closed my eyes. The words, the cycle, it was all happening again. "I'm scared," Monroe said. "He hasn't hit me, not yet, but he yells. He tells me I twist things, that I make him crazy." "Monroe," I said, voice steady but soft. "You don't deserve that, none of it. And you don't have to stay." She looked at me, tears spilling now. "What if I can't do this alone?" "You won't be," I said. She cried harder then, and I let her. Later, I gave her my guest room. She walked down the hall like someone walking into the unknown, and maybe she was. I sat in the dark of the living room, watching the rain smear the window panes, thinking about how many women Griffin had broken just enough to keep. Not this time. The myth of the good son had burned away in the storm. All that remained was truth and the women who had survived it. The photograph had always hung in the hallway, in a delicate oval frame with gold leaf edges. My mother at 25, lips pressed into a line, her posture perfect even as her eyes looked somewhere beyond the camera. I passed it daily, barely noticing. But that morning, I stopped. I don't know what compelled me. Maybe it was the echo of Monroe's voice down the hall, softly humming to herself. Maybe it was the silence of a house that had always been too good at burying sound. Or maybe, finally, I was ready to look. I stood in front of the photo and saw her. Audrey, the woman who raised me with clipped sentences and rules disguised as love. "Don't be too loud. Don't wear that color, it makes you look desperate. Let the men lead." Her teachings were never violent, only consistent. Womanhood was a performance, and we were expected to keep the curtain closed on anything messy. I used to believe she was cold, but now I wondered if she was just tired. Tired from biting her tongue through 2 decades of marriage to a man who drank silence like water and believed vulnerability was for the weak. My father had barely spoken to us unless it was to correct or command. And when he died, Audrey didn't cry. She folded his clothes, vacuumed the hallway, and told me to stop slouching. She raised me to endure, not express. And I raised Griffin the same way. Except with him, I softened it. I made excuses. I turned endurance into worship. I stared into my mother's eyes, and for the first time, I saw myself staring back. The mirror on the opposite wall caught my reflection. Same arch of the brow. Same faint line between the eyes. I stepped closer. The room was still. My heart, not so much. "I broke the cycle too late," I whispered. "But not too late to fix what's left." There were 3 of us, I realized. 3 women separated by time but bound by silence. Audrey, who taught survival through compliance. Me, who traded strength for denial. And now Monroe at the edge of her own unraveling. And all of us, in one way or another, had loved broken men and paid the price. Later that afternoon, I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. I searched for the contact listed on the business registry, the one tied to the rebranded version of Sadie's company. The business was barely breathing, having lost traction after Griffin's team failed to meet supply deadlines, but the infrastructure was still intact. I opened a new bank account under a pseudonym and wired a private donation to Sadie's original project, Threaded Roots. She had quietly resurrected it on her own, outside of Griffin's reach, working with a small team of local artists. There was no fanfare, no press, just quiet work with deep roots. I included no message, no explanation, just the money, enough to buy equipment, hire 2 part-time assistants, and launch a regional campaign. It wasn't redemption, but it was a beginning. Monroe asked few questions about what I was doing. She'd moved into the guest room, slowly reclaiming small routines, morning tea, evening walks. Her energy shifted from survival to curiosity, from silence to presence. One night, as we folded baby clothes donated by a local shelter, she turned to me. "Do you ever regret having Griffin?" I hesitated. It wasn't the question I'd expected, but I understood it. "No," I said, "but I regret the kind of man I let him become." She nodded slowly. "Do you think that makes you a bad mother?" "I think it makes me an honest one." I pulled out a folded letter. It was one I'd written to Sadie but hadn't sent. "I can't undo the past," I read aloud, "but I can stop pretending it didn't happen." I left it unsigned, and later that week, I placed it, along with a small donation envelope, at the front desk of the studio where Sadie taught weekend art classes. The receptionist didn't ask questions. She just tucked it under the desk and promised to pass it along. Small things, tiny actions, but each one felt like a weight lifted. And with each gesture, I began to see Audrey differently. She hadn't known how to stop the cycle, but maybe she'd tried in her own way. Maybe her silence was self-preservation. And maybe mine had been too, until it wasn't. One afternoon, I went into the attic and pulled down an old quilt my mother had made. It was scratchy, faded in spots, stitched with patterns I never appreciated as a child. I draped it over the rocker in the guest room, where Monroe liked to read. It felt symbolic, handing down something warmer, even if imperfect. Later that week, Monroe asked if I'd go with her to her first prenatal appointment. I said yes, without hesitation. As we sat in the waiting room, she looked nervous, hands clutched around her phone. "Did you ever feel ready?" she asked. "No," I said. "I just felt responsible." She laughed softly. "That makes sense." The nurse called her name and she stood, glancing back at me once before disappearing behind the door. And I thought, not of Griffin, not of the life I'd failed to shape, but of the one forming now, quietly, inside a girl who hadn't yet learned to call herself a woman. A life that could still be shaped by truth and love, and enough of the right kind of silence, the kind that listens. That evening, I walked past the photo of my mother again. I didn't stop this time, but I touched the frame as I passed. The transfer went through on a Tuesday morning. I used the name Elin March, my grandmother's middle and maiden names, a quiet nod to someone who, as far as I knew, had once sown hope into hand-me-downs during the Depression. It felt right, distant enough not to trace, personal enough to feel honest. The money wasn't a grand gesture, just enough to anchor Sadie's project, to purchase materials, rent studio space, and pay 2 women she'd quietly been mentoring. It was a seed, no strings, no name, but anonymity, I've learned, is rarely as seamless as it feels in theory. 3 weeks later, the email came from Tasha. Subject, not as subtle as you think. The body, we need to talk, she knows. Be at the studio Thursday at 5. Come as you are. I stared at it for a long time, feeling the familiar heat of exposure. I thought I could step out of the story quietly, slip Grace under the door and disappear before anyone noticed. But redemption doesn't work that way. It requires standing in the light, even when the shadow feels safer. The studio looked different now. Still modest, still filled with Sadie's signature minimalism, but it breathed. There were shelves of dyed fabrics, walls painted with affirmations from local artists, and a glass display case near the front filled with handcrafted journals and hand-stitched clothing. I arrived early and waited in the corner like a parent at a school recital, proud, terrified, hoping not to be noticed and needing to be. Sadie came out from the back with Tasha. They were mid-conversation, both carrying boxes, laughter hanging in the air like smoke from an extinguished fire. When Sadie saw me, she didn't flinch. She didn't look surprised. She just exhaled. Tasha gave me a nod. Not warm, not cold, just a bridge between. "I figured it out when the receipt had your bank's routing number," Sadie said. "You always forget to change the auto-signature." I smiled weakly. So much for covert philanthropy. She motioned me over to a long work table covered in fabric samples. "Come see what you helped build." The air smelled like eucalyptus and cedar. Warm lights overhead gave everything a kind of soft glow. The women in the back were laughing over tea. Music played faintly from an old speaker. Fleetwood Mac, I think. I wasn't trying to take credit, I said. I know, Sadie replied, but I still needed to see your face. To know this wasn't just guilt with good manners. It's not. She nodded once, then walked me through the space, showing off the collection. She was confident, precise, alive in a way I hadn't seen before. This was hers, built not from the ruins of Griffin, but from the steel of survival. We're having a launch event this weekend, she said. Small, just community partners, local buyers, the women who've been part of this from the start. You should come. I hesitated. Are you sure? I wouldn't invite you if I weren't. Tasha walked by just then, raising an eyebrow. Wear something clean, she said, and bring something to eat. We're not feeding ghosts. The event was held in a repurposed greenhouse behind the studio. Strings of lights hung from the rafters. Tables lined with Sadie's creations and community art surrounded a makeshift stage. The scent of fresh herbs and candle wax floated through the open doors. Laughter, music, gratitude in motion. I stood near the back, unsure where I fit, until Monroe appeared beside me, wearing one of Sadie's linen dresses, visibly pregnant, glowing in a way I hadn't seen before. She invited me too, she said. Said she wanted the baby to hear strong voices early. We both smiled. Sadie stepped onto the stage to a ripple of applause. She wore a slate-gray jumpsuit, minimal makeup, hair loosely tied. She held the microphone like it belonged to her hand. 5 years ago, she began, I stood in a courtroom and handed over the last of what I thought I had. I walked away from a life that wasn't safe, from a man who told me I'd be nothing without him, from a home that watched and stayed silent. I felt the sting of that line. She wasn't cruel, but she was unflinching. I didn't think I'd ever trust myself again, she continued. But then I started building something. Not just a business, but a place where women could speak, create, and belong. That's what this is. That's what you've all helped me make. There was more applause, real, earned, until a commotion stirred near the entryway. Griffin. He looked out of place, out of sync with the room's energy. Jacket wrinkled, face strained, eyes scanning until they landed on Sadie. You're welcome, everyone, he called, walking forward. This little empire, built on lies and theft. People shifted uncomfortably. Sadie stayed calm. She took my work, he said louder. My designs, my funding, my connections. No, Sadie replied, microphone steady in hand. I took my life back. He laughed bitterly. You didn't build this. You copied me. Sadie stepped forward. This company existed before you ever touched a spreadsheet, before you repackaged my vision and sold it to the highest bidder. You used my voice because yours couldn't say anything real. You feel good now? Playing the victim? I'm not playing, she said. I lived it. The room was still. Griffin's expression twisted, confused, angry, like a man watching a throne disappear. You don't get to erase me. Sadie's voice didn't waver. You already did that to yourself. Security moved toward him, but he turned and left without another word. Whispers followed in his wake. Sadie turned back to the microphone. Sorry about the interruption. He's not the story anymore. Applause roared, this time louder. I stayed behind after the event to help clean up. As I gathered empty glasses and plates, Tasha approached with a folded sheet of paper. Someone dropped this, she said. Didn't say who. I opened it. A printed news alert from a financial oversight board. Griffin Caldwell under investigation for fraudulent misrepresentation and embezzlement linked to multiple failed startups. I stared at it, heart sinking, not from surprise, but confirmation. Tasha raised an eyebrow. Guess the truth always wants out. I nodded, folding the paper carefully. Outside, Sadie stood near the garden barefoot, watching the string lights sway in the night wind. I walked over. He's being investigated, I said. Fraud, embezzlement. She didn't look surprised. His pattern always ends in collapse, she said. Only now it's public. We stood in silence for a while, both looking at the stars. Thank you, I said, for letting me be here, for letting me see this. You earned it, she said. Not because of what you fixed, but because you finally stopped pretending nothing was broken. We watched as Monroe walked across the lawn, hand resting gently on her belly. Is she staying with you? Sadie asked. For now, I replied, as long as she needs. Sadie nodded. It feels like a new season, I said. She smiled. It's about time. And just like that, the seed we'd both planted, hers with courage, mine with remorse, finally began to bloom. Monroe didn't ask for help, not directly, but she accepted it piece by piece, in the small, quiet ways people do when they've finally decided to stop pretending. After the launch event and Griffin's outburst, something in her changed. Her steps slowed. Her eyes stopped scanning rooms for danger. Still, she flinched at loud noises. Still, she slept with her door locked. I found a lawyer, a woman named Colleen who worked with a nonprofit that specialized in domestic partnerships, custody rights, and protective services. Monroe met with her twice a week, slowly unraveling the story she hadn't told even herself. She didn't want to file anything just yet. Not until the baby's here, she said. I want a clean start, not a war. So we made lists, found her a part-time job at the library, enrolled her in an online program for early childhood education. I handed her my laptop one night and said, "Search until something makes you curious." The next morning, she was already halfway through a lesson plan. There was something about her that pulled me in. Not just the vulnerability, though that was certainly there, but the echo of who I used to be before I hardened into someone who wore silence like armor. She was me at 20, hopeful, unsure, trying to be enough for everyone else before herself. I hadn't seen Lena in over a year when she called. "I heard about Griffin," she said, voice steady. "Figured you might need some backup." "He's not here," I said. "I didn't think he would be." She paused, then added, "I'm coming over." When she arrived, Monroe was in the kitchen, humming and stirring a pot of soup. The scent of thyme and garlic filled the house. Lena stepped into the warmth without comment, hung up her coat, and said hello like we hadn't lost years to pride and miscommunication. That night, we ate around the same table I'd once kept pristine for holidays and apologies. Now it held mismatched bowls, chipped mugs, and the sound of cautious laughter. Monroe laughed first, shy and bright. Lena followed, a low chuckle under her breath. I laughed last, surprised to hear it come from my own chest without cracking. We didn't talk about Griffin. We didn't have to. He was arrested a week later, off-screen like the villain in a play who disappears between acts. Word spread through the neighborhood, whispered behind hedges and over back fences. Fraud, embezzlement, a string of investors who had finally pulled back the curtain. I didn't visit him. I didn't write. The silence between us became its own sentence. What struck me most was how nothing changed in the house. No chaos, no yelling, just stillness, just breath. The emotional aftermath was quieter than I expected. Not the dramatic collapse I feared, but the slow thaw of a woman stepping out of denial and into presence. Monroe folded his last sweater and donated it without comment. I deleted his number and didn't feel the impulse to save it. Instead, I picked up the phone and called a therapist. Her name was Miriam, soft-spoken, mid-50s, always wore gray cardigans and never interrupted. "I don't know where to start," I told her during our first session. "Then don't start," she replied. "Just sit. Just be." So I sat, and for the first time in years, I let someone see the parts of me that weren't mother, fixer, protector, peacemaker. I told her about Audrey, my mother, and the way she'd taught me to swallow myself before anyone else could. I told her about Derek, how I mistook stoicism for stability, cruelty for structure. I told her about Griffin, and how I gave him everything except the tools to be whole. Miriam listened. Sometimes she cried. More often, she just nodded and waited. One session, she asked, "When did you learn that love meant silence?" I didn't answer, but the next week, I brought in Sadie's letters. The week after that, I brought in my own. I wrote them at night, longhand, on cheap stationery with soft corners. To Monroe, to Lena, to myself at 20, to the women I judged, to the ones I failed. I didn't send them, just folded them neatly and tucked them in a box by my nightstand. Some nights Monroe would join me in the living room, her hands wrapped around a cup of mint tea. We didn't always talk. Sometimes we watched old movies. Sometimes she asked about what I was like before marriage, before motherhood. "You think the baby will like me?" she asked one night. "The baby will love you," I said. "You'll make sure of it." I don't want to make the same mistakes. You won't, I told her. You already stopped pretending. Lena came by more often now. She and Monroe developed their own rhythm, trading recipes, organizing the garage, rearranging the kitchen. They teased me, ganged up on me during board games, argued over coffee strength. It was chaotic. It was real. One Sunday, the three of us sat at the table after dinner, leftovers still warm, dessert half eaten. The light from the kitchen was soft, catching the edges of Monroe's cheekbones, the silver in Lena's hair, the lines around my mouth. We looked like a family. Not the one I'd imagined, not the one I'd forced into shape, but one born from wreckage and will. Cautious laughter bloomed again, fuller this time. Less a surprise, more a habit. And as I looked across the table, I felt something shift. Not forgiveness, but grace. Healing didn't come like a revelation. It arrived in fragments. Quiet, almost forgettable moments that stitched themselves into something whole. It came in the slow unpacking of guilt, in therapy sessions that left me hollow and strangely grateful. In Monroe's voice growing louder, her shoulders less burdened, in laughter that no longer felt borrowed. I still saw Miriam every Thursday. We rarely touched the surface anymore, we went deeper. Into memories I'd folded so tightly I forgot they were there. Into the moments with Audrey where love had been a checklist and tenderness a foreign language. Into my own complicity, the years I spent mistaking protection for parenting, silence for strength. You learned how to survive, Miriam said once, but now you're learning how to live. It was slow, but it was true. Monroe's pregnancy unfolded like the turn of a season, quiet, steady. One morning she stood in the hallway, a hand resting on her swollen stomach, and said, "I think I want to name her Wren." I smiled. "After the bird?" "They're small but fierce," she said. "They build homes out of whatever's available. They sing, even after storms." Wren, a name that carried wind and wildness, a name that felt like beginning. Sadie came by the house shortly after the baby was born. She brought a basket of handmade swaddles, a card, and a look of peace I hadn't seen in her before. Wren was only a week old, still red and soft, her cries barely more than sighs. I held her by the window that afternoon. The sun diffused through the curtains, casting us both in soft light. Her tiny fingers curled around mine, instinctive, unknowing. Her skin smelled like milk and hope. I stared out at the garden Monroe and Lena had started, herbs, tomatoes, wildflowers creeping up a trellis, and thought, this is what we build from ashes. Sadie watched me from the kitchen. "She looks good in your arms," she said. "She feels like forgiveness." Sadie smiled faintly, then pulled out a folder from her bag. "I've been thinking," she said. "We're expanding the business. I could use someone with a head for organization and finance, someone who knows how to fight quiet battles." "You want to hire me?" "Partner," she said. 50-50, if you're ready." I didn't answer right away. I just looked at her, at this woman I had wronged who still believed in rebirth. Later, I told Monroe. She smiled. "You'd be amazing." Lena rolled her eyes. "About time you got off the sidelines." And just like that, a new chapter began, not marked by a grand gesture, but by choice. Daily, ordinary choice. We moved through those early months like dancers learning new steps. Monroe found a rhythm. Lena found purpose. I found presence. But healing has a way of testing its foundation. It came in a phone call. "Mrs. Caldwell?" a woman's voice asked. "I'm calling regarding a discrepancy we uncovered in some business records tied to the Threaded Roots trademark." I tensed. "Go on." "There's evidence your son not only copied elements of the original design and brand, but he filed documents under a falsified identity tied to Sadie's birth name. Documents that list her as inactive management while designating himself as the sole owner." I gripped the edge of the counter. "He didn't just steal her ideas," I said. "He stole her name." "I'm afraid so." The caller explained the next steps. Investigations, potential criminal implications, further court proceedings. I took notes, thanked her, and hung up. I stood there in the kitchen, heart pounding, a part of me ready to unravel again. But another part, the part that had held Wren, that had chosen therapy, that had stood in Sadie's studio surrounded by women who had survived, remained steady. I didn't call Griffin. I didn't even think of how to explain it. I simply opened a drawer, pulled out the letters I'd written to him over the last year, the ones I'd never sent, and walked out to the garden. It was dusk. The air smelled of basil and soil. I set up a small fire pit Lena had found at a flea market, folded each letter carefully. No anger, no tears, just words that had served their purpose. I lit a match. One by one, I fed the letters to the flames. They curled and blackened, the smoke rising into the darkening sky like confessions too old to carry. When it was done, I sat on the porch and watched the fire die. My hands smelled like ash, my chest like air. Inside, Wren began to cry. I rose, went to her, picked her up and rocked her slowly, her warmth pressed against my shoulder. "You're safe," I whispered. Not because the world was suddenly kind, but because the women who would shape her future had already chosen not to lie. I'd never been inside a courtroom before. Not like this. I'd watched enough courtroom dramas to expect the weight of judgment, the stiff suits and careful stares, but nothing prepared me for the way truth echoed in that space, louder than any gavel. Griffin sat at the defense table, jaw clenched, eyes forward. He didn't look at me, not once. The courtroom was cold. Marble floors, oak benches, fluorescent lights that flattened every face into something colorless and exposed. I sat beside the prosecutor, my hands folded in my lap, a tissue clenched between my fingers like armor. Sadie sat behind me, her presence solid, steady. Monroe and Lena were on either side of her, all of us a wall, fractured once, now bound by something unspoken. The charges were read aloud: wire fraud, embezzlement, falsifying business records, identity misrepresentation. Griffin pleaded not guilty. It was my turn to speak. They called me to the stand. I rose on shaking legs, walked the path I never imagined I'd take, and placed my hand on the Bible. It felt heavy, not sacred, just real. The court clerk asked the question. "I do," I said. The courtroom sketch artist captured the moment. My lined face, the crumpled tissue, Sadie's gaze fixed behind me like a hand on my shoulder. I'd seen the sketch later. It didn't show fear. It showed something harder to define: grief sharpened into purpose. I answered the questions. First, simple things: my name, my relation to the defendant, then the harder ones. "Did you provide financial support to your son for his business ventures?" "Yes." "Were you aware those ventures were based on stolen intellectual property?" Number not at the time. "What changed?" A pause. Then, "Sadie," and the evidence she provided, and the guilt I could no longer explain away. My voice didn't crack when I said it, but my hand trembled slightly, and I let it. They asked me if I believed Griffin acted with malicious intent. I looked at him for the first time. "I think," I said slowly, "that he learned to take what he wanted and count on the women in his life to stay quiet." I was the first. A ripple of murmurs. The judge called for silence. They asked why I chose to testify. I took a breath and looked out at Sadie, then Monroe, then Lena, 3 women who had held up a mirror when I least wanted to see myself. "Because silence built this," I said, "and silence won't end it." It wasn't just about Griffin anymore. It was about all of us. How we inherited the rot and called it tradition. How we excused harm in the name of loyalty. How we watched women break and blamed them for bleeding. The defense tried to paint Griffin as misunderstood, a struggling entrepreneur, a man who took shortcuts because he felt overlooked. They questioned my maternal instincts. "You still love your son, don't you?" "I love the boy I raised," I said, "but I don't recognize the man he became." They pressed harder. "Do you think testifying against him is how a mother should act?" I didn't flinch. "I am not breaking my family," I said. "I am finally building it." The judge didn't react, but the courtroom did. I felt it shift, like breath being held and released at once. Griffin's attorney didn't have much after that. The evidence was too clear. The paper trail was damning. The voices, mine, Sadie's, Monroe's, even old investors, wove a net he couldn't slip through. The verdict came a week later, guilty on all counts. He didn't speak when it was read, just sat there, blank. He was sentenced to 5 years. Bittersweet justice. No one clapped, no one cheered. The air was heavy with what could have been. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, microphones flashing, questions flying like bullets. I didn't speak. Sadie gave one brief statement. This wasn't about revenge. This was about truth. Monroe held Wren close to her chest. Lena stood behind us, hands in her coat pockets, eyes scanning the chaos like she was counting every cost. That night, we had dinner at my house. Quiet, simple, bowls of soup, warm bread, Wren in a carrier between us, sleeping soundly. You okay? Lena asked. No, I said. But I'm getting there. Monroe nodded. Same. Sadie raised her glass of water. To the end of silence. We clinked glasses, nothing dramatic, just the sound of women deciding not to disappear. Later, I sat in Wren's room, holding her as she stirred in her sleep. Her breath was soft, steady. Her tiny hand rested on my chest. I testified against your father, I whispered, because I want you to grow up in a world where no woman has to whisper at all. Outside, the wind rattled the trees, but inside, we were still. Scars remain, I've learned. But light doesn't ask for perfection, only honesty, and that, finally, I could give. The garden didn't bloom overnight. It took weeks of tearing up old soil, pulling weeds that had made themselves too comfortable, and digging into hardened earth that hadn't been turned in years. I wore gloves Monroe bought me as a gift. Soft, floral patterned, more decorative than practical, and let my hands ache from the work. Each morning before the house woke, I planted something. Basil, chamomile, lavender, tiny seedlings that needed care, not perfection. A row of marigolds along the edge, stubborn and bright, like a border that meant, you're safe here. The quiet had changed. It no longer rang hollow. It felt earned. No longer the echo of what I refused to hear, but the breath between chapters. Monroe had moved into her own apartment nearby. Wren's nursery was painted a soft green. She kept a picture of the three of us on her bookshelf, me, her, Lena, laughing around the table with Wren asleep in her arms. She started school in the fall, part-time at first with plans to finish her degree in early childhood education. Her first paper was titled, What We Pass Down and What We Choose to Reclaim. She still visited on Sundays. Sometimes we cooked. Sometimes we said nothing. But she always left Wren's blanket on the rocking chair, like a thread she didn't want to cut. Sadie's business had grown. What began as a handful of women in a modest studio had blossomed into a full cooperative. They leased a larger space across town and opened a gallery, mixing their textiles with community artists. She was working on a memoir. She didn't say much about it, only that it wasn't about Griffin. It's about surviving myself, she said once, and remembering who I was before I thought being loved meant being small. Her words stayed with me. We painted a mural together. It covered the side of the new community center, right near the garden beds. A line of women in shades of blue, terracotta, and gold, arms linked, eyes open. Above their heads bloomed symbols, fire, roots, a phoenix, a compass, and near the top, a wren in mid-flight. Sadie had added the inscription, Resilience is the quiet you fight to keep. I looked at it every time I passed. Lena stopped calling every week. She didn't have to anymore. She just showed up. Sometimes with a bottle of wine, sometimes with an old photo album we hadn't opened in years. She called it archaeology therapy. We'd pull out the old pictures, rewrite the captions. That's not Thanksgiving, she'd say. That's the year Sadie almost left, and we pretended not to notice. We laughed more. But we also let the hard things stay in the room. We didn't try to fix them. We just stopped hiding from them. On Wren's first birthday, the backyard was full of noise. Balloons swaying on the porch, music from Sadie's playlist, children tumbling through the grass, and women whose faces I'd come to know through years I could never take back, but now wouldn't trade. Monroe gave a toast. Lena grilled too much food. Sadie made her famous lemon thyme bars. I took a picture with Wren in my lap, the garden behind us in bloom. I didn't post it anywhere. I printed it, put it in a frame near the kitchen. That night, after everyone left, I sat on the porch in the dusk. The breeze was cool, gentle. The air held the scent of soil and citrus. I could hear Lena's laughter echoing from the kitchen, Monroe humming a lullaby down the hall. I reached for the stack of mail I hadn't opened. Most of it was junk. One was a card from an old friend, another a dental appointment reminder, and at the bottom a letter. No return address, familiar handwriting. Griffin. I held it without opening. The envelope was thin, one sheet, maybe two. No weight to it, physically or otherwise. I didn't cry. I didn't burn it. I just sat with it in my hands, the edges soft from being touched too long. Part of me wanted to tear it open, hear what he had to say, whether he'd found remorse or more reasons. Another part, the one that had rebuilt a family from wreckage, that had held truth when it trembled, knew something else. Some doors don't close because we slam them. They close because we outgrow the house behind them. I placed the letter in a drawer in the hall, not forgotten, just not urgent. The moon rose. Wren's laughter carried faintly through the screen door. I whispered the words aloud, quietly, only to myself. Family isn't who you forgive, it's who you fight for. Then I got up, walked back inside, and left the past where it belonged. In the garden, the marigolds nodded gently in the wind. If this story stirred something in you, stay close. We tell the truths families hide behind silence. The next chapter might echo your own, because sometimes healing begins not with answers, but with the courage to ask better questions.